Laura, I'm so excited to have this conversation, this overdue conversation with you. But I think the timing maybe is perfect because I know you have had a very crazy summer with the company. So I'd love to maybe just kick the conversation off with hearing about what you guys have been up to over the summer and how, where the company is now.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I've been promising a lot of LinkedIn post updates that I haven't gotten to, so maybe I'll just be able to use this episode as a grand update. It was, it's been a really crazy, I would say, 7, 8 weeks. I think we met back in May, I would say, maybe even late April when we got to meet in person and said, yeah, let's do this. And now we're in the middle of the summer, which feels crazy. We were in New York for New York Tech Week, which was a lot of fun. I highly recommend if founders haven't been, definitely go check out Tech Week in New York. Can't speak for San Fran and LA, but we plan to attend. And if it's anything like New York, we're really excited. It was super, super successful for us. We got to meet a lot of people, and we were kind of entering a place that we didn't really have a lot of contacts. We didn't really have a network. Very different from the Canadian tech ecosystem, where it's a more of a reunion when I walk in somewhere versus a cold call. And so it was a lot of fun, but people were really welcoming. People were really excited to talk about our company and learn more about what we're doing. And so it was a very energizing kind of environment to be in. From there, my co-founder Janessa went to San Francisco. I went to Los Angeles. So it was definitely crazy. I ended up at Collision after, got super sick like most people did after Collision, and then was heading to Startup Fest. So it was very much a back-to-back kind of time. It was really interesting to kind of see the differences between the US and Canadian fundraising ecosystems, I would say. Anyone who's talked to me in person over the last couple months or 2 months has heard me say this, but it felt very that Americans were looking for reasons to invest in you versus I felt like here people are kind of looking for reasons to not invest. I think that just really drills down into the risk tolerance of the two nations and how different they are. And I think they're really like, oh, I really want to get in on this potentially huge opportunity. Whereas in Canada, it's more like, okay, well, what have you done? What's your traction? Like, how can I almost ensure that I'm going to have success versus like take a risk and hope that I have success. So it's a bit of a different mindset, I would say, towards investing. As an angel investor, I think I lean much more towards the American mindset where I'm like, this is a good vibe. And so far it's working out really, really well for me. So I have no complaints. But that was kind of one of the main stark differences that we found and the speed at which things went. Janessa was on a panel during Tech Week, and we had a VC come right up to us and be like, I want your data room. And we were just like, we've never spoken to you, right? Now we ended up being too early and it was a quick no, and that's all good. We expected plenty of no's still, but it was very, very fast, the whole process going through it. Just from the let's chat to the data room to the yes or no, it's just been hyper speed. And I feel like we've gone through so many of those cycles with different VCs and different institutions since we were in New York at the end of May versus we're still going through some of those cycles like a year later here in Canada. So it's a really interesting difference.
What do you think drives that difference? Is it that the pool of opportunity is smaller here? Is it the economy?
I don't think it's new. I definitely don't think it's new. I think, I know everybody and their mothers has been talking about it. I do think the capital gains tax has impacted the investing very, very, that's more recent, of course. I do think
Yeah.
just wholly, whether it's VC or otherwise, Canadians are just more risk averse when it comes to potential huge opportunities. So there's that aspect too. And like I have, I'm lucky enough that I have some great friends who are VCs, and a lot of them were even just like, just go to the US. You know what I mean? Especially as a non B2B SaaS company, which is what I think Canada is very comfortable funding. I think a lot of VCs are always, I don't know, maybe this is just an assumption or I'm projecting, but I feel like they're always trying to find the next Shopify. And they're not really looking elsewhere other than a handful of people. I know Alan has spoken on the podcast with you, and he's a pretty big advocate for hardware. So I'm a big fan of his. And I know they've done some semiconductor stuff in their portfolio and things like that. So you do have those like odd outliers who kind of understand the space a bit differently. But I would say generally the B2B SaaS is where everybody's looking for the next Shopify. And then ultimately, I think too, like there's just less capital. Like I went into a room, I was at a family office event at New York Tech Week, and the hosts of the event, they manage 30 multi-billion-dollar family offices. And this is like the host alone. And that didn't even include all of the family offices where I was in the room with them. So there was billions of dollars in that room that were ready to deploy, which somebody in
Wow.
that room, I was just sitting there like, I can't even, I came from finance and I can't wrap my head around the amount of capital in that room. So you just have that as well. And like, there's just way more deals. There was somebody here it was at the Collision Panache party. Somebody was going around asking every VC, like, oh, how many deals are you doing this year? How many deals are you doing this year? And the average answer he was getting was 2. If all of the VCs in Canada are doing 2 deals this year, you're not going
Right.
to get a lot of founders being funded, right? We don't have that many funds. So especially kind of at like the different stages, right? It's like, okay, if early stage funds are 20% of the funds, then, you're looking at what, how many deals? 100, right? That's
And
not
what is
even
that like in the
10%.
US? Like how on I know it's there's just so many people, but is it looking more like 10 per fund? Like what's their average deal per
Really kind
year?
of depending on the fund. But even when I was doing my research and I was like, I looked through, I earmarked probably 500 funds that I was like, I think they might be a fit. Then I went through
Okay.
every single one to see, okay, what's their thesis? What does their portfolio look like? Can we, do my due diligence myself and do the research before I reach out to them? I do try and be mindful of that and not just cold outreach. And it was really
Right.
interesting because some of them, I was like, I can't even get through your portfolio. Like I am scrolling and scrolling and scrolling and scrolling. I'm like, I can't spend 2 hours just clicking on every single one of your portfolio links. But I would say, you're looking at some of them doing a couple hundred a year. That's not obviously not necessarily the average, but you probably have a couple funds, like just 2 or 3 funds in the US are probably doing as many deals as like all of the Canadian funds total. Yeah.
It's mind blowing. It makes it so different when you're thinking about looking for investment. Like why struggle in such a small pool in Canada? You mentioned that it was such a success going this summer, I guess, because there was quite a few different places. Did you guys have a goal going into the summer of what you wanted to achieve or what made it successful in the end?
I think a big part of it for us was suss it out. See what happens, get the people, because we honestly we really didn't know many people. We knew, 2 or 3 people in the ecosystem in New York. They ended up connecting to a few people in like San Fran and LA. Like, so when we visited, we had people to meet up with. But it was honestly one of those things where we were just kind of like, you know what, we have the plan in the sense of like, we've figured out, there's a list of 300 VCs that we want to target. We've outreached to a lot of them. We had a couple really great meetings booked, but a lot of it was just kind of like, let's see what comes to us. Let's see what the environment is like. Is it really that much greener on the other side? Is the grass really? And so we honestly didn't know what to expect. You hear it all the time from founders like, oh, the US is so much easier, it's so much better, and fundraising is so much better. But you never really, we're an IoT company and we're in a space that's at the intersection of 2 different industries, being health and climate. So we also didn't know how is that going to be received, because do people want to put you in like the health tech box or the climate tech box? Do they want to be really rigid around those lines? And how is hardware being treated in the US? Is it significantly different than Canada? Do people care? Do they not care? Hardware, everyone tells you you're playing the game on hard mode. And so it was interesting to see that I found there was definitely some people I spoke to who were just like, we don't do hardware, not really our thing. But tell
Yeah.
me about your company. I might know someone. There was a lot of like really collaborative, I would say, things. And I've experienced a lot of that too, I would say, here in Canada. But I I don't know if it's the benefit of my network is the reason I experience those things, or if it's like inherently like that. And so I found people to be really, really helpful. And for us, like, I mean, success obviously is closing the round. Ultimately, that is the main goal. We're looking and hoping to do that around the end of September, because obviously the summer quiets down and people are away. So we're re-engaging kind of a lot of those conversations in August.
I wanted to get a little bit into Ecologica.
Yeah, so Ecologica, I think most people probably listening know that I joined at a more of a pivotal moment and not from the very get-go. So it was a very interesting experience for me as a co-founder coming on a bit later. But essentially, it was born out of my co-founder Janessa's struggles. She's essentially a bit of a canary in a coal mine for poor air quality. So throughout her entire life, she really struggled with like illness, these mystery illnesses. She would end up in the hospital 2 or 3 times a year, with a flu-like symptoms. It would last a while. Nobody could tell her what was happening. And she was also like at the prime in terms of peaks, like health and fitness. She was Team Canada, 400-meter hurdles, like absolutely could not have been, more physically fit. And yet this was still happening. And so they took a really holistic approach to try and figure out what was causing it, because obviously, you don't want to see your kid going down a couple times a year. And so lucky for her, her mother is a psychotherapist. So has kind of that holistic outreach and like approach. And her dad has an autoimmune disorder. So they've always been really, really focused on inflammation and how inflammation, in fact, like affects the body. And so I believe it was kind of towards her first year in university where she kind of like walked into this restaurant and realized like if she stayed there, she'd get sick. Like she felt the reaction happening. So she's essentially having like an allergic reaction to poor indoor air. And I actually got to witness it firsthand when we were in New York. Like her lips and stuff, like they started swelling up a bit after a few days. Like you could tell that she was struggling with the air quality. So it's gotten better as she's gotten older, but it's definitely still affecting her. And when she was in India, she was there as a strategy consultant for a tech company during her master's. And she ended up in the hospital, which was, to her, not surprising. Like, okay, the air quality's bad.
Yeah.
I'm affected by this. I have a sensitivity to it. However, a number of her colleagues also ended up hospitalized. And that's when she kind of realized that this was a problem that wasn't just hers and it wasn't just affecting her, but that it was a bit more of a global problem, and that healthy air or clean air shouldn't be only for those who are like born in the right places or who can afford to go to those places. And she just kind of felt like she saw a glimpse of the future. And so that's where Ecologica was essentially born. And we're at the intersection of health and climate. And we focus on indoor air quality and how it affects health specifically, and have like a predictive health modeling angle. So essentially what we kind of do or go in and do on the IoT component of the business is we go into a building, we'll monitor, we'll see what's going on, where are the airflow problems, where are the high occupancy rates, all that kind of stuff that affects air quality. If there's meeting rooms that are generally jam-packed, you're going to have less oxygen in them, things like that. And then based on those baseline measurements, we can put in our products. Our products are a bit unique because they are not simply just air purifiers in the straight sense of the term. We do have filters inside of the units. However, they produce what's called a hydroxyl. Hydroxyls are essentially free radicals, but they're responsible for fresh air outdoors. So when you go to like a cottage or you're in the mountains and you have that like crisp, clean smell of air, and it like knocks you out at night, you sleep great, all that kind of stuff, like that's what we're essentially producing inside. So the difference between a little bit between what we do and what your standard air purifier does is we create hydroxyls. So they're what's responsible for fresh air outdoors when you have that crisp, clean smell that you can feel in your whole body. So we bring that inside just to create a healthier space, because we spend most of our time indoors, and indoor air is actually 2 to 5 times worse than outdoor air. And so that's kind of our really interesting side of the business. We're really, really a great fit for the regulatory tailwinds, because hydroxyls have been shown to actually not just reduce the spread index of like COVID, for example, by 73%, but also to act as surrogate ventilation. So what that means is you can actually bring your energy costs down and decarbonize your building more effectively by using hydroxyls within the space. And then kind of on the data component, the main thing is collecting the data, make sure the spaces are healthy. One of the big things that we do is we don't just monitor for air quality. We don't just want to see what's in your air, but we actually layer it with our proprietary health data set in order to see how it's actually impacting people's health. So it's that true intersection of climate and health.
That's so fascinating. Do you find having this like data story really helps intrigue investors, or is it two different investors that are interested on the data side versus the hardware side?
Really good question. I think the right investors really appreciate the both sides of the business. I would say there's some people that we're talking to that really see the predictive health modeling and where it can go, and how we're essentially using our hardware to enable that while still helping people. That's a big part of our values and our ethos is like, could we just monitor and have a predictive health modeling data company? Absolutely. Do
Right.
we want to do that when we have the technology to improve people's lives? I don't think we do. That feels wrong to me on a just a human level. There's a couple types of feedback that we get. So, oh, this sounds like kind of too business, and it's like we understand that feedback. However, it's also being enabled by it, right? So the data part of the business is being enabled by the hardware. And so we kind of need that in order to do the rest. And so I would say it's kind of the story we tell, we've gotten really good about telling our story in our way and understanding that it's not going to be a fit for everybody. And that's okay, because we've found a lot of those people who do understand it. They do understand why it's really important and they're interested. So that's kind of where we're at is like and I don't want to come off crass saying this, but like we don't want to convince people of the problem or of the solution. Like we want to be talking to the people who understand that this is a problem and there needs to be a solution.
I love that the story, like the human story behind it, and that you both are so passionate about it and have something very real in your lives to relate to why this problem needs to be solved. And it seems that I think you and I have connected before, but a lot of what drives you in your priorities are your passions for both Ecologica, but also, and I know I just mentioned what the tech, but I want to know a little bit about the passion drive. What the tech maybe first, but what has driven you to build this like side hustle, maybe you would call it, while co-founding a business?
Yeah, it's funny too, because I kind of always said, I'm like, I don't know if I'm founder material. I don't know if I'm cut out to be a founder. And when I initially joined Ecologica, I wasn't. I joined on the strategy and ops side, and there was never any pressure from either side for anything. It was a very natural, I would say, kind of evolution of our relationship and kind of how we did business. So that felt really good. But it was very funny because Janessa asked me to step in as a co-founder 6 days before I launched What in the Tech. So I ended up becoming kind of a double founder in the span of a week when a year ago, myself was just like, oh, I'm not cut out for the founder life. And I realized, it was probably because I hadn't found the right things, because now I can't really imagine doing anything else. And it's interesting. So What in the Tech it was born out of a couple different experiences, essentially. I'm lucky enough to get to, attend all the tech conferences here in Canada, talk to a lot of different founders and a lot of different folks who are, whether they want to build a company or building a company, maybe they're investors, that sort of thing. Through that, a couple gaps essentially became evident to me. I realized that we just like little things, like we didn't have really a fulsome tech conference list publicly available to anybody. Like that felt weird. And I was kind of surprised by that. So it all started with an Excel spreadsheet that I shared on LinkedIn. So I put together this list. I was like, I've been to most of them. I know which ones are happening. I can shove them all onto a list and share it with the world. And that
Right.
seemed to do pretty well. And then from there, I kind of started thinking more about like, okay, what are the other gaps? And one of the big things that I'm trying to be constantly conscious of and like understand, especially because I do work with a lot, I would say, of younger women specifically. So I do a lot of mentoring and conversations and like workshops with young women. The tech space can be really intimidating. And a
Yeah.
big part of that is because of the language. If you don't know what a Series A is, or you don't know what a CTO is, going into a conversation, like, first of all, going into a conversation in a strange place with strange people is already difficult, right? Even for the most extroverted, like personable, like it's tough for me and I have no anxiety. It's like, I'll just go and talk to anyone. And sometimes I find it difficult, right? And so that was one of the things where I was like, okay, like let's start doing like a bit of a crowdsourced dictionary. So at this point, I was like, okay, now I have a Google form. Now I have this spreadsheet of events. Like, what am I going to do with it? And that's kind of how it was born. And it was born out of essentially me trying to create a space in the ecosystem that isn't gate kept, that everybody has access to, like fully accessible, and that just has like information for people on like, it just gives them a jumping off point. If you're going into a meeting with somebody, you can quickly scan over the definitions and be like, okay, now I'm like kind of up to speed. I've like at least heard the term before. I'm not completely unfamiliar with the acronym, and things like that. And I've put up a page. I've put up a couple things now. It's grown since. It's definitely, I had to kind of not focus on it for the last few months because we've been fundraising, and you just kind of have to prioritize, unfortunately. But I'm hoping, we did launch an accelerator list, an incomplete accelerator list, a few weeks, maybe about a month ago now. And that was really exciting because one of the things I find, especially when you're early, is like time is of the essence, right? There's a lot of people who are building their companies as like a side hustle still, or they still have a full-time job and they're building kind of in the evenings. So we, instead of putting together just a list of like, here's the list of all the accelerators and the links to them, we actually tried to be mindful to provide information about them. So, are they dilutive or non-dilutive? Are they hybrid? Are they focused on a specific industry or type of person or type of founder? Things like that, because that'll give you a much better snapshot to decide whether or not you apply. And I can tell you right now, some of these applications can be really hefty. So if you're going to waste time applying, you want to make sure that you're spending the time correctly or for the right things. So I'm hoping that it's a bit of a space to make it a bit easier for people to find what is, the right fit for them. And then hoping to launch a VC list this summer as well. So that'll be incoming. There's a trusted allies page, essentially, of folks that I've worked with either personally or I know a minimum of 3 founders who have. And they've all spoken really highly of them, have great experiences. I generally just always try and include people who I believe lead from a lens of how can I help versus how can I sell you. And so I believe that the people on that list will grab coffee with you. They will give you, 15 minutes of their time and give you a quick piece of advice or things like that, or send you to the right person if they're not the right fit. So, just trying to build a community resource where all of this knowledge is together in one place, because everybody has bits and pieces of it and it just doesn't seem to be centralized.
It's such an amazing resource. And I know right now what you're building is the community hub and a place for anyone within the founder space to come. But my head is like the future of like how big this can be. And I don't know if this is your mindset, but like the monetization routes that you can go with it is just so extensive and so exciting. And it's so needed. Like it is very confusing. Even I'm not a founder. I'm not looking for a VC, but just to learn, just to engage, it's very hard to know where to start. There's like a ladies in tech brunch type of thing, or there's this, but you're kind of like dropped into a few things and it's very confusing about how to really get yourself involved in that community. So I as someone who is a founder, I only imagine how valuable that resource is. And it's even funny about the acronym dictionary that you mentioned. When I started, I have brand and growth marketing background in CPG and in tech, but I started in the pharma space 2 years ago, and there's so many terms. And it's like, I know I'm an expert in marketing, but when I sit in that meeting and everyone's throwing around these terms, you feel like a moron, and you're like, I can't even talk to the thing I'm an expert on because I can't keep up with the lingo. I don't even know what we're talking about. So I started an acronym dictionary just for myself, where I just like plug in words so I can, command F them during a meeting and figure out what the hell are we talking about. So I love this for like a community sake, because I think someone might have identified a really cool problem, be building a really cool solution, but is struggling to just speak the lingo.
Well,
And
and I feel
want
like
me to
I, maybe it's an overreach to say I think it's stifling innovation, but it is what I believe. Because I think when certain types of founders have had success over the last, like, let's call it 15, 20 years, a lot of investors too are looking for repeat successes, second time founders, third time founders, exited founders. And that to me means that the same type of people are going to be consistently funded, which is going to mean that the same type of founders are going to consistently exist. And I also believe that that means that problems that I might not face will not get solved. But just because I'm not facing that problem doesn't mean it shouldn't be a problem that gets solved. As women, femtech has kind of, I want to say it's taken off, but like there's still plenty of horror stories behind the scenes. So it's one of those things where I think it's more a widely used term and accepted type of company, but there's still plenty of hoops for femtech founders to absolutely jump through and justify and all those types of things. Like the things I've heard from some of these founders are just still to this day is awful. So I don't want to say that it's an easy road by any means, but it's like at least something that people now know what it means. They're kind of, okay, they're aware that there's like companies focusing on women's issues because we make up 50% of the population and it's a problem that needs to get solved. And so, but if you're consistently funding the same founders and the same people, then you don't have that opportunity to increase that diversity of innovation and ideas. And I think that's a problem.
when you first got into the space, you must have felt a lot of these challenges. And now I think you're pretty, very deep into the tech, founder tech entrepreneurial space. But how did you start, whether as a founder, as an angel investor in the startup space, and start to feel comfortable building yourself up as like an advocate now for early stage founders?
Yeah, I think, I am lucky, and I think I mentioned this. I'm lucky in the sense that I'm somebody who isn't deterred easily, or, I don't very real, anxiety issues or things like that that prevent me from just kind of going into a circle of people and starting a conversation. I very much sympathize with those who can't necessarily do that. And I do try and give tips and tricks on how to get around those types of anxieties and fears. But I think for me, I had been in finance for quite a long time. So I'd done a lot of like digital transformation. Like I was kind of like the resident tech expert at the firm and that kind of thing. And I'd always been a bit adjacent to tech. Like a lot of my friends were in tech. I knew a lot of people in it. So I felt like even when I went into it, it wasn't as an unfamiliar space as like it might be for somebody else. I had already made a couple of angel investments by the time that I had joined, including some of the guests that you've had on the podcast. And so it didn't feel as far. I was on the Tech for Sick Kids committee already at that point. So it felt kind of like a natural stepping stone for me to get into this space. And then,
Mhm.
of course, just like getting to meet so many people through my role at BetaKit, like I was able to have a lot of those conversations. And I feel like I really approach conversations and networking and relationship building, whatever you want to call it, from a very human standpoint. I know that there's plenty of people who don't like me, and that's okay. And I don't expect everybody to like me, and I'm okay with that. But I think that the people who do know me, who've worked with me, who have kind of been around me in terms of what I do and how I do it, they recognize that I approach things just from a how can I help lens. And I do genuinely mean it. If I can help somebody in any way, I will do my best to do that. And so that's kind of been always my approach, and it's helped me to build really strong relationships. And then when you have some of those foundational people in the ecosystem lifting you up being there for you, talking about you in rooms that you are not in, and just raving and ranting about you, it just gives you the confidence to like conquer anything. And I'm very, very lucky to be in a circle of people who I know are saying my name in rooms I'm not in, or are constantly thinking of ways that like, oh, they meet a new VC, they're like, have you talked to Ecologica? Have you talked to Laura? Like, oh, I like, anybody I meet, like, oh, I might talk to this founder and I told them about what in the tech, or, things like that. It's those types of things for me keep me going. Like the knowledge that people are excited about what I'm doing and how I'm doing it, and that for me, and seeing that it's making an impact, is what drives me to like continue doing it.
It's also a nice reminder, I think, for myself or anyone listening, to when you have that opportunity to be someone else's champion and mention someone else's name in that room, because you want someone to do it for you. And it is, talking about like stifling innovation and stifling growth, like we all have the power to kind of push that forward a little bit. So maybe I'll ask this now then, because it's on the theme of, helping people and removing barriers. I think as we start businesses, there's a lot. When I started my company a long time ago, there was so many things that people told me as a founder, so many myths. And you start your own business and you have these things in your head and you're like, holy shit, like 90% of this was not real. So I'm curious if there was any myths that you hear or have heard as a founder or within, the founder space, that you would just like sit someone down and be like, this is not true. Like, this is not the way it needs to be.
Um, I think I will say, I think, because of the people I was surrounded by, I think I had a pretty good idea of what being a founder was going to be like.
Mhm.
I think it's much more difficult for solo founders who don't have those sounding boards.
Right.
But I think one of the things that I would probably say is like, other people don't necessarily know better. And I think that's something where there's a lot of times where, especially kind of the newer founders, they hear, feedback from a VC or feedback from another business owner or whatever, and they take it really, really seriously and really to heart. And it goes against their gut. Maybe it goes against what they were thinking for their business, that sort of thing. So, and I think I'm a huge advocate for feedback. I think it's really, really important. I also think it's really important to be mindful of who it's coming from and where, like, what it's about. I think, and I don't mean that necessarily like, oh, are they a good person or a bad person? But it's like, are they an expert in this? Right? Is somebody who has never worked in this field, isn't in climate tech, isn't in health tech, doesn't understand air cleaning technology, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, is telling me that like this business maybe isn't going to work. But then somebody who is an absolute expert in the space and, is sitting at dinner with the Surgeon General in the US, they think it's a good idea. Like, whose advice and whose feedback should I be taking? Right.
The guy
And I
has
think
no
that,
idea, right?
well, and that's the thing though, is I think, and you get so much conflicting advice, right? You're always going to be like this person and that person, and they're saying different things. And well, I did it this way and I did it this way. And you kind of have to, I would say take everything with like a 20 or 30% grain of salt, where you're just like, okay, I hear it. I'm going to see if it's applicable to my business. Is the person saying it understanding of the space that I'm in, right? Like, you have to kind of ask yourself all those questions, because just because somebody has built and exited a company, or just because somebody is in a position of power with like potentially funding you or things like that, it doesn't necessarily mean they know better. There are times where there's great feedback, don't get me wrong. But I would say, again, be really mindful, because I think that's a bit of a myth of like, oh, like other people will like give you the business advice you need and things like that. And sometimes you just know what's best. Like, you have to trust your gut.
That's such a important piece. And and I like that you said it doesn't mean just ignore it. It's assess if you should action it, which is a interesting, like, specific on that
Yeah.
piece.
Yeah.
Um, my last question for you, as you know, the podcast is called How I Became. And throughout your story and what you've shared, I'd be curious at this present time, if you were to name the episode, what would you name it?
Yeah. I saw this question in the document and I feel like I've been thinking about it for like 6 weeks.
Oh God.
And it's bad because I haven't come up with a great answer. I don't feel like I've come up with a great answer. But I think, based on where I am today and what I'm doing, I think I would like to think that the future, what it holds for me, is continuing to advocate for those who need it. And ideally, my absolute goal is like how I became Canada's like biggest angel investor or like investor in companies that aren't traditional businesses or traditional SaaS businesses. All I want to do is just like crush Ecologica, exit, have this huge thing on my plate where I'm like, I just absolutely, and then just hand out $50,000 checks to founders who like just need somebody to believe in them. And I want to be that person.
I love that. I love that for you and for, the Canadian founder space. So I'm rooting you on. Laura, I've so many more things that I want to talk to you about, so many more topics and questions. So I'm, thinking maybe there will be a part two, but I really appreciate you taking the time dealing with all of our tech glitches today, but making it work and sharing your story. I'm so excited for you and everything to come with Ecologica and what in the tech. It's just a really exciting like point in time right now for you. So thank you for sharing everything.
Thank you for having me share my story. I appreciate it. It's been really exciting, and it's you ask very thoughtful questions, and I really appreciate that.
Thank you.